"I'll take her and the twins," said the farmer as the auctioneer raised his hammer. The hammer was a piece of hickory worn smooth at the grip, and the man holding it had a voice like a boot sole dragged across gravel. He'd been going since morning. Cattle first, then tack, then a mule with one good eye. The crowd was thick for a Tuesday, cold front coming down from the north. Men in coats they hadn't worn since February, breath hanging in the air between bids. I wasn't there to buy anything. I want to be clear about that. I'd come to settle a debt with Abe Caro over a fence line dispute we'd had since spring, and Abe wasn't at his usual spot near the fence rails, so I'd moved up through the crowd to look for him. That's all I was doing. That's how I tell it anyway. The woman was standing on the low wooden platform they used for livestock. She wasn't weeping. That's the first thing I noticed. She wasn't weeping, and half the women I knew would have been. She was standing straight, chin up, both hands clasped in front of her, and she was looking at a fixed point somewhere past the crowd, the way a person looks when they've decided to be somewhere else inside their own head until a thing is over. She was 30, maybe 32, with dark hair that had come half loose from its pins. Her dress was travel-worn, and she had one scuffed boot tied tighter than the other, the lace broken and reknotted 3 times from the look of it. The twins were beside her, a boy and a girl, maybe 5 years old, maybe 6. The boy had his hand in his mother's and was staring at the ground. The girl was staring straight at the crowd with her mother's same look, that 1,000-yard fixed-point stare, and she was holding a corn-husk doll missing one arm. The auctioneer was reading from a paper. Widow. Husband deceased, debts outstanding, farm already sold off to settle. 2 children healthy. Good worker, no complaints from prior employer. She'd taken a housekeeping position in Ellsworth to survive the winter that had ended when the family moved east. No kin in the territory. Situation. Public charge, county's burden, therefore offered for placement in a willing household, terms negotiable, labor to settle any outstanding ledger. That's how they said it, placement in a willing household, terms negotiable. There were men in that crowd who heard different words than I did. I could see it in the way a few of them shifted forward. One fellow near the front, I knew him, rancher named Dills, twice widowed, bad-tempered. He was already pulling at the hem of his coat, getting his hand ready. I hadn't said a word at an auction in 11 years. Not since I'd bid on a team of roans and lost them to a feed merchant from Dodge who didn't know a horse from a hat rack. The auctioneer raised his hammer. I don't know exactly what moved through me in that half-second. I'm not a man who acts on feeling. I never have been. I work by what I can see and what I know to be true. And what I could see was a woman who hadn't broken and 2 children who hadn't either. And what I knew to be true was that a man like Dills would have that woman's spirit worn to nothing inside 6 months, and the children would grow up under a roof where the air itself was mean. I said it loud enough to carry. "I'll take her and the twins." The hammer stopped. The auctioneer looked up. Dills turned around, and the look on his face was somewhere between insulted and amused, which told me something useful about him. I wasn't looking at any of them. I was looking at the woman on the platform, because it seemed to me that the least I owed her was to look her in the eye when I said it, so she'd know what kind of man was speaking. She looked back at me. She didn't look grateful. She looked like she was calculating. Good, I could respect a woman who calculated. My name is Harlan Cutter. I've worked the same 160 acres south of the Smoky Hill River since 1871. Before that, 4 years in the war, Union, infantry, came back with all my parts and most of my hearing, which is more than I can say for the men on either side of me at Chickamauga. I was 38 years old the morning of that auction. I had a 2-room soddy I'd built myself and added a sleeping porch onto the back, a well that ran clean, 40 head of cattle, a good-tempered draft horse named Clement, and no wife. I'd been close to married once, a woman named Dorothy Haynes from the next county, but she'd taken up with a hardware merchant, and I'd decided the matter was settled and moved on. I was not, in any measure, prepared to take in a widow and 2 children. I told the auctioneer my name. He wrote it in his ledger, and the terms were set in about 4 minutes. There were no other bidders once I'd spoken, which told me something about the crowd's conscience that I tried not to dwell on. The outstanding debt she carried was $11 and some cents, money borrowed from the county poor fund for the winter. I paid it off the right side of my wallet, which meant it was money I'd been holding to replace a hinge on the barn door. The hinge would wait. She came off the platform without help, which she didn't need, and the children followed, the boy still looking at the ground, the girl still carrying her one-armed doll. They had one bag between them, a canvas satchel with a broken buckle held shut by a length of cord. I walked them to where Clement was hitched at the post. I untied him and stood there. "I'm Harlan Cutter," I said. "My farm is 6 miles south. You'll have a roof and food, and I'll not ask anything of you that a decent man would be ashamed to ask." She looked at me for a long moment. "Nora Pell," she said. Her voice was even low, nothing spent in it. "These are Caleb and me." The boy, Caleb, finally looked up. He had a bruise along his jaw, yellowing, a week old at least. I didn't ask. "All right," I said. I put the satchel in the wagon bed and helped me up. She went without fussing, tucked her doll under one arm, and then I offered my hand to Nora. She took it. Her grip was firm, a working woman's hand, and she stepped up into the wagon without any of the hesitation that suggested she'd been treated as something breakable. Caleb climbed up on his own. We rode the 6 miles in near silence. I pointed out landmarks the way you do when you don't know what else to offer, that draw their floods in spring, that stand of cottonwood marks where the river bends. If you see smoke from the Hensley place on the ridge, it means nothing good. They burn wet wood. She listened. She didn't fill the quiet with questions or noise. When we came up on the soddy, she said, "It's solid built." "Built it myself," I said. She looked at it the way a carpenter looks at another carpenter's joints. "The roof line's straight," she said. It was. I'd spent a week getting it right. "There's a sleeping porch off the back," I said. "You and the children will have it. I'll sleep in the main room." She didn't argue, which I'd half expected her to. She nodded once. The first week was a learning of territories. I rose at 4:30 and she was up before me the first morning, the fire already going, coffee on. I came into the kitchen and stopped. She looked over her shoulder and said nothing, just pointed at the cup she'd set on the table. I sat down and drank it. It was the best cup of coffee I'd had in 4 years. I didn't say that either. She found the lay of the kitchen by the second day without me showing her. Found where I kept the cornmeal, where the lard was, that the bread tin sat high because I'd built the shelf before I'd thought about how often I'd reach for it. She moved things without asking me, and I noticed the change each time, but I didn't say a word because every change made sense. The children stayed close to her those first days, Caleb especially. He watched me the way a dog watches a stranger, not aggressive, just waiting to see what the stranger would do. I didn't push him. I went about my work, brought in wood, checked on the cattle, patched the fence line along the east quarter where the posts had heaved in the thaw. Didn't ask him to help, didn't tell him to stay out of the way. Third morning, I was splitting wood behind the barn, and I looked up and he was standing about 10 feet off, watching. "Want to try?" I said. He thought about it. "I don't know how." "I'll show you." I set a smaller piece on the block and handed him the hatchet. He was left-handed, which I hadn't expected, and he swung it wrong twice, and then I crouched down and showed him where to put his weight, and he split the third piece clean. He stared at it like it had surprised him. "Again," he said. We split wood for an hour. He didn't say much else, but the distance was gone. Me was different. She talked from the start, not chatter, more like running commentary on whatever she was looking at. She told me the cornhusk doll was named Wren, and that Wren had lost her arm when Caleb accidentally stepped on her during the winter in Ellsworth, and that Caleb had cried about it even though he'd pretend he didn't. She told me that her father had been a wheat farmer, and that he'd smelled like flour and saddle leather, and that he died of a chest sickness the winter before last, and her mother had tried very hard to keep things, but you can't keep everything. She said that last part the same way she said everything else, plain, just information. I fixed Wren's arm that evening with a length of cord and a scrap of fabric from the rag bin. I didn't make a ceremony of it, just left her on the table when me wasn't looking. She found her in the morning and looked at her for a long moment and then looked at me across the table and said, "Thank you, Mr. Cutter," in a voice that was almost her mother's. "Harlan," I said. She thought about it. "Harlan," she said, and went back to her breakfast. Nora worked. I need to say that plainly because it was one of the things about her that I understood from the first day and respected from the third. She worked the way I worked, without complaint and without comment, just steady and competent, and always at the thing that most needed doing. She fixed the broke buckle on the satchel the first week, using an awl she'd found in my tool tin. She patched the curtain in the sleeping porch that had a burn hole in it, singed on some previous owner's lamp, I suspected, and she patched it so neatly you had to look for the seam. She tended the kitchen garden I'd let go to hell the past 2 years. I'd put it in when I first built the place with some idea that I'd keep it, and then the second spring I'd let it go because there was no one to tend it and I could get vegetables from the Hensley widow in trade for labor. Nora went out one morning and looked at it and then looked at me. "How much of this do you want to keep?" "All of it if you're willing." She nodded and started the same afternoon. We did not talk much those first weeks, not in the way people talk when they're getting to know each other. We talked about the work, about what needed doing, what could wait, what I knew about the land and the weather patterns, and where the water ran in July when the creek pulled back. She asked good questions, not women's questions, not domestic questions, but farmers' questions, the kind that showed she understood land and season, and what a dry spring meant for the fall. I found myself answering in more words than I usually used. One evening she was sitting at the table after the children were down, mending by lamplight, and I was reading the week-old newspaper I'd picked up in town. She said, without looking up from her work, "Why did you do it? At the auction?" I put the paper down, because Dills was about to bid. She looked up. "You know him." "Knew him for years. He's not a bad farmer, but he's a mean-tempered man, and he'd had 2 wives already, and neither one of them lasted long." She was quiet for a moment, looking at her mending. "There were other men who didn't bid." "Yes. Why didn't they?" "Some of them had wives," I said. "Some of them had other reasons. I don't know all their reasons." "But you don't have a wife." "No." She looked at me then, direct and measuring. "So it was only about Dills." I thought about it honestly. "It was the first reason," I said. "Standing there, yes, it was Dills, and you standing straight." She looked at me for another moment, and then went back to her mending. "All right," she said. May came in wet, which was good for the fields, and I put in wheat along the south quarter, and she was out there with me 2 mornings running, helping set the seed rows while the children played along the fence line. She worked a row and a half to my one, not faster, just steadier, fewer pauses. I noticed that but didn't say anything about it. You don't say that kind of thing to a woman, even as a compliment. It comes out strange. The children had settled. Caleb had started coming to the barn with me mornings, unofficial, no discussion, he just showed up. I gave him small jobs checking the water trough, measuring out Clement's feed. He was serious about them in the way small children are sometimes serious, a little bit of held breath in everything he did, like he was worried about getting it wrong. He never got it wrong. He had good hands and a good eye, and I told him so once flatly, not a fuss about it. And he went still for a second and then nodded and went back to his work, and I could see in his back, in the set of his small shoulders, something that had been tight in him ease out a half-inch. Me came to the barn too, but she was there for the company, not the work. She sat on the fence rail and talked about the dreams she'd had, about something she'd seen in the creek, about a question she had about the war that she'd apparently been saving up, which was, did the horses get scared? I told her they did, some of them, and she thought about that and said, I would be too. I think it's all right to be scared if you're a horse. I said I thought that was probably right. One Saturday afternoon, I went into town for supplies and I ran into Abe Caro finally, which reminded me that I'd never settled the fence line business that had brought me to the auction in the first place. We sorted it out in about 10 minutes over coffee at the feed store. I owed him $2 for a strung section. He owed me labor for the post work. We called it even. He asked me about the woman I'd taken on. News traveled fast in a country that thin. How's that working out? He said. Careful, the way men are careful when they don't know whether to be congratulatory or sympathetic. Fine, I said. She a good worker. Better than me, I said. He blinked at that. I paid for my flour and left. The trouble came in June, which was about when I'd figured it would. 3 men rode up on a Thursday morning, unannounced, which was itself the first piece of bad manners. The leader was a man named Corvin Speck, who ran cattle on the land east of town and had a wide reputation for finding legal angles on things that weren't quite legal. He had 2 riders with him, young men, hired hands. They stayed on their horses. I came out of the barn and stood in the yard. Cutter, Speck said. Speck. He looked past me at the soddy. Nora was in the doorway, she'd heard hooves, and she was standing the same way she'd stood on the auction platform. Children behind her. I've got a situation, Speck said. The widow there, she's got a debt outstanding with me from her husband. Bill Pell took a loan from me 2 years ago, grain seed money, $40 plus interest. Bill Pell's dead. Debt transfers. Bill Pell's dead, I said. His debts are his. The farm was sold to cover county debts, Speck said. The ledger I hold wasn't county, it was private. Courts will back me. Have you gone to the courts? He smiled. Not yet, thought I'd come to an arrangement first. I looked at him for a moment. I knew what arrangement meant in Corvin Speck's language. It meant he wanted the woman's labor under his roof, under his terms, in a way that was worse than what Dills would have had in mind. What's the figure with interest? I said. He named it. $53. I didn't move my face. I'll need to see the paper, I said. He reached into his coat and handed it down. I unfolded it and read it carefully. Bill Pell's signature, 2 years back, $40, 6% interest terms, no date of repayment specified. The paper was real. The debt was real. I folded it and handed it back. I'll have the money for you by Friday, I said. Something moved through his face. He'd expected different. He'd expected argument, or for me to not have it. He looked at me and then at Nora in the doorway and then back at me. You're taking on a dead man's debts, he said. I'm settling an obligation, I said. They're a difference that matters to you. He put the paper back in his coat, looked at me for another long moment. Friday, he said. Friday. They turned and rode out. I stood in the yard until the dust settled, and then I went back into the barn and stood there with my hand on Clement's neck for a minute, feeling him breathe. $53 was half my summer savings. I went into the house. Nora was at the table, the children in the sleeping porch. She looked at me and I could see she knew what I'd said. You didn't need to do that, she said. I know. The money. The hinge on the barn door is still working, I said. I can wait on other things. She was quiet. She had her hands flat on the table and she was looking at them. She wasn't a woman who showed things easily. I'd learned that, and what I was watching was her working to keep level. Why, she said, same question as before. The auction question, asked again. Because you've worked this place for 2 months, I said, and you work it like it's yours, and whatever Bill Pell owed Corvin Speck, you had nothing to do with it. She looked up. Her eyes were steady, but something in them had shifted, not wet, not soft, just open in a way they hadn't been before. "I'll pay you back," she said. "There's no need." "There is," she said. "For me there is." I thought about that. "All right," I said, "if that matters to you." "It does." I nodded. "Then we'll find a way for it." I went to town Friday morning and left the money with Speck's man at the feed store, who gave me a receipt, and that was the end of it. Speck never came back. That's how men like him work. They push at what they think will give, and when it doesn't give they find easier ground somewhere else. Word got around. Not from me and not from Nora, probably from Speck's man, who had a loose tongue. By July, when I took the wheat crop into town for the first sale, 3 different men shook my hand, and one of them, an old farmer named Beaumont who'd been in the territory since before the war, put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Good man, Cutter," and that was all, and I thought about that the whole ride home. I'd been farming that land for 11 years. I knew most everyone and most everyone knew me. I'd been neighborly, kept my fences, lent my tools when asked. But I'd been a bachelor alone on his 160 acres, and the truth was that men don't pay much attention to a man like that. You're part of the landscape like a fence post. You're there. You're solid. Nobody particularly notices. Something had shifted. I noticed it when men talked to me. There was a directness, an eye contact that had been polite before and was something else now. Not different talk, just more of it. Like I'd earned a thing I hadn't known I was trying for. I thought about that too, on the ride home. Nora had been sleeping on the porch with the children those first weeks, which was right. But by July, Caleb had started sleeping in the main room on the pallet by the stove, which he'd decided on his own, because he said to his mother, which she relayed to me without expression, that it was a man's job to be between the door and the sleeping people. He was 6 years old, and he'd decided this. I said nothing. I moved my things to give him the wall side. He came to me one morning in late July. I was mending a harness collar in the barn, and he stood there for a minute with his characteristic held breath and then said, "Mr. Harlan." "Caleb, if a man asked my mother to marry him," he said, "what would be the right way to do it?" I put down the collar. I looked at him. He was looking at the barn floor, very serious. "I think," I said carefully, "that a man would want to talk to her first, before he asked, or at least the same time, so she knew what he was thinking." He nodded. "Not to the children first." "I think it's her choice," I said, "so her first." He thought about this. "She's been watching you," he said, "when you don't see her." I said nothing to that. "Me thinks you're all right," he said. "Me likes you." "I'm glad." He picked up a nail from the ground and turned it in his fingers. "I think you're all right too," he said, to the nail. Then he set it on the edge of the workbench and walked out. I sat there in the barn for a while. It was August before I said anything. The wheat was in, the summer cattle money was accounted for, the soddy had a new porch post I'd set in June, and the kitchen garden had done better than I'd seen it do in 3 years. Nora had put up preserves, 6 rows of them on the shelf, neat and labeled in her handwriting, which was careful and clear. I watched her work the whole summer, not in a way I was ashamed of not watching, just noticing. The way she read the sky, the way she could calm Clement when he was spooked and I couldn't, just by talking to him low and even. The way she put the children to bed every night, the same words, the same order, some small ritual they'd carried from before, and how they settled into it. I noticed all of it, and I did nothing about it for a long time because she was a woman who'd been sold in a yard, and I wasn't going to be the man who moved too fast on a woman in that position. But August was different from May. She knew this land now. She knew the names of the neighbors and which ones to trust and which ones to greet politely and leave behind you. She knew the well draw and the flood patterns and where the mice got in on the north wall. She'd paid back $30 of the 53. In installments she kept a careful tally of in a small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer, and she'd told me she'd have the rest by fall. We were sitting on the porch after supper, the children inside. the day still holding a little light, and I had my coffee and she had hers, and we were looking at the fields. I said, "I want to say something, and I want you to hear it without thinking you have to say anything back." She turned and looked at me. "This summer," I said, "the way this place runs, the way the children are, I know what I brought you into, and I know it wasn't a choice you'd have made freely, and I want to say that I know that. And I know that you've been building something here that's yours now, not just a labor agreement, and I'd like it to keep being yours." She was still watching me. "I'm not good at saying this," I said. "You're doing all right," she said. "I'd like to ask you to marry me," I said. "Not for the land or the house or any of that. Just because you're who you are, and because I think I've known since the auction that I was going to want to ask you when the time was right." The light was going orange across the wheat, long and low. She turned and looked at it for a moment. "You know who I am," she said, not a challenge, genuine. "I know what I've seen this summer," I said. "That's who you are." She looked at the wheat a little longer. Her coffee cup was in both hands and she was turning it slowly, that habit she had when she was working through something. "Caleb talked to you," she said. "He asked me a hypothetical question." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "That child," she said, quiet almost to herself. Then she looked at me. Full on, no calculation now, just looking. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you, Harlan." I let out a breath I'd been holding since May. She saw it, and the corner of her mouth moved again, further this time, and I thought it might be the first time I'd seen her close to a real smile. "You've been nervous," she said. "I'm not a man who asks questions he doesn't know the answer to," I said. "You didn't know my answer." "No," I said, "I didn't." She reached over and set her hand on my forearm. Not a soft thing, just her hand, flat and warm, the working woman grip. She left it there. "I've been watching you," she said. "Caleb told you." "He mentioned it." "He was right." She looked at the fields again. "I've been watching you since the auction, the way you looked at me when you said it. Most men wouldn't have done that. Looked at you like I was a person whose opinion of them mattered," she said. "Most men in that yard were looking at the auctioneer, or at Dills. You were looking at me." I thought about that. I hadn't known I'd done anything particular. I'd only thought it was the least I owed her. "I wasn't going to be in a yard with a woman and not look her in the eye," I said. She nodded. "I know that now," she said. "I knew it then a little. It's why I calculated you as safe." That's a practical way to look at it. I'm a practical woman. "I know," I said. She left her hand on my arm until the light was gone and the stars were coming out, one first and then the rest all at once, the way they do in a clear Kansas sky in August. Inside, I could hear me's voice, and then Caleb's voice, and the soft sounds of children settling into sleep. I didn't say anything else. Neither did she. We sat in the dark and drank our coffee, and the fields were invisible now, but I could hear them, the dry whisper of late-season wheat, and I thought about the year I'd been invisible in this valley, a fence post, a landmark just there, and how a woman had stood straight on an auction platform, and a boy had asked me a hypothetical question in a barn, and how 160 acres could feel, on a given August night, like the whole world. Nora's hand was still on my arm. That's the story, that's all of it.